These videos with setups used to be just to share the tunes, but it seems that with Assetto Corsa they will have a new use. The game keeps deleting my saved setups, so I guess they will do as an emergency backup too. For the second Assetto Corsa setup video, I'll drive the Sauber C9. To be fair, I started driving it just for the looks, but once I started doing some laps, I couldn't stop. It's one of these old cars where there are not two equal laps. The quality of your driving in every corner is going to make a huge difference to the lap times. You can do 20 laps to a track and never be fully satisfied with any of them, or at least that happened to me. An update arrived in the middle of all this work, so I made sure the car was still working well after it. The car seems to have got a little bit faster after the patch, and the ranges in the damper screens have changed. It might be a coincidence, but just in case I will stick to the new default damper values. I felt no reason to make changes, the car handling was good, and I was getting faster lap times than before. The improvement might come from somewhere else, like updates in the tires or somewhere else, but just in case I will not touch there. As always, I have created the tune driving in some classic GP tracks, like Imola and Barcelona, and by the end I was quite happy with how the car behaved. This time, it's probably a good idea starting with some driving tips. Until I managed to understand what the car wanted from me, I couldn't start finding the changes that were needed. The braking distances are huge. I expected much better, so it took a while to adapt. Also, the way to shorten them is not to start braking late, but to stay on the brakes for as long as possible as you turn in. I often say that minimizing the coasting times is a good idea, and with this car it's something you should always do. Stay lightly on the brakes all the way into the corners. It will help the front a lot. You'll get even more lateral grip than just staying off the pedals. On corner exit, the car is very tricky. The turbo makes the response of the car very different at low and high reps, and the car only has 5 gears. You'll need some time to get used to the power curve of this car. Understanding when the wheel spin will come is something that you should predict. In this car, correcting once you are sliding is not the way to go. The car might be very loud, but the pitch of the sound is very low. Sound won't be a good indicator of wheel spin. It's hard to hear a sudden increase in engine revs. Sometimes, when I watch my own driving in a replay, it sounds like I'm taking ages to come back full throttle. But then, you see the wheel and you can notice that the car is on the limit and there's no more traction available. Keeping up your minimum speed is also a good idea. You have a lot of power, but it's hard to put it down. Lines where you make a really late apex, hoping to get a nice exit, don't work all that good. If you let your speed drop a lot in the middle of the corner, you will have a hard time picking up speed again, even if you get a more straight line out of the turn. I used the default boost levels in all this driving, but when I turned it up, it was easy to adapt. You just have to learn the new braking points and be a bit more patient on the power. I will say that the medium is the best compound for most races, so that's what I used. I usually started driving with 50 kilos of fuel to get used to how the car will feel in races. I also left the car with a medium downforce level, to make sure that any balance problem was easy to spot. But my first advice to get performance out of the car is to crank the wing up. It will work in almost every racetrack. You get far more traction, you shorten the braking distances, and you simply get faster. The straight line speed loss is not a big deal, you'll make far bigger gains. This is the MotoGP layout for Barcelona, and it's a shame the game doesn't have a heads-up display for the pedal inputs. The last two corners are a great example on how a little bit of braking helps the front to bite. I brake very deep but very lightly into both of them, and then pick up the power smoothly. Being smooth with the pedals is very important. You cannot jump in the brakes full power immediately like in a modern single-seater. You cannot release the brakes abruptly either, and then you have to pick up the power quite slowly. It takes a lot of discipline and patience. And that's it for the driving tips. Now let's have a look at the setup itself. I moved the brake bias to the rear a bit. I use 53-47 as a starting point, and then move it around as I need it. The front lockups seem to hurt much more than small rear lockups in this car. It's surprising how much you can lean on the rear brakes to turn the car. As I said before, I used around 50 kilos of fuel for these runs. Of course, you should load the car with as little fuel as possible. Be careful if you play with the boost levels for the races. It can change the consumption quite a lot. I use 3 or 4 for the wing in these practice sessions, but for almost every racetrack you should max it. It's simply faster. You don't have a front spoiler to play with, so forget about balance. Set the rear wing depending on the downforce levels each track demands. If you lack front grip after maxing the rear wing, make changes somewhere else. I didn't need to do it. You simply can't set an ideal gearing. 5 gears are not enough for this car, so you'll have to do your best to make sure you have a gear that reacts sort of okay in the exit of every corner. If you play around with the boost settings, it's very likely you'll need gearing changes. Turning up the boost will make you start hitting the limiter much sooner than before. I left the power diff at a low level. It made life a bit easier in traction zones. 20 worked okay. It helps to turn the car when you are nowhere near the grip limits, and it makes life easier when you push and start spinning the rears. In this car we have both coast and preload available. Coast will have more influence when you are braking. I let it quite low too. Going even lower can make turning even better, but if you use a brake bias that lowers the rear a lot, it can make the car unstable when you trail brake. Preload has more influence mid-corner, when you are not braking or accelerating hard. Here I use an even lower value to fight understeer in long constant radius corners, like turn 3 at Barcelona. The front of the car is quite lazy when you are off the pedals, so you should stay low here no matter the track. The car is very easy to control in the center of the corners, so don't be afraid of using minimum values. I did all my driving on the medium compound. It takes a while until the wear kicks in. It's a good race tire. I didn't test the soft. I prefer to have lower mechanical grip to make easier to see what was wrong with the balance. I use pressures a bit lower than default, but not too much. I use 18 and the default was 20. The temperatures were still okay for the medium compound. It's easy to overheat the rears if you start spinning them, so be careful. Once you overheat them, you'll have low grip, and then you start to spin them more, and it keeps getting worse and worse. Be gentle. I reduced a bit the rear camber levels to improve traction. It's important that you always keep an eye on the data in the left part of the screen. As you move other items, the camber and toe will change there, and these are the real values in the car. Setting -1 won't always give you -1 camber. I tried to keep the front around -3 and the rear around -1. The car comes with a bit more negative camber for the rear, but it makes hard putting the power down. The same happens with toe. When I made suspension changes, the toe levels I was getting with the same numbers changed quite a lot, so I finished the suspension work and then tried to keep the real toe levels close to the ones the car came with. I tried to get a slight front toe out, a slight rear toe in. Ride height makes a huge difference for this car. It gains a lot of performance from running low. How low you can go will change with every track, so it's up to you to find the ideal level for every circuit. These values were still safe in all the tracks I drove. The car very rarely touched down, and when it did, it was harmless. I softened the rear springs a bit, again to gain better traction. Once I started trail braking into corners, I liked how the front worked, so I came back to the default levels for the front after trying others. Even with the sprint rate so close to default, it was possible to lower the car quite a lot, so I don't understand why they don't do it by default. It makes the car much easier to drive. For the sway bars, I went a click softer for the front and a click stiffer for the rear from default. The car was quite bad in long lateral levers on default, and this helped a lot. You could probably soften the front even more, but it's very important having the rear perfectly steady when you get back on the power. You don't want to accelerate with the rear slightly out of shape. These were the damper values I used before the patch. I had done some work on them, but once the update came, the range changed for many of the items. As I explained before, the car became a bit faster with the same fuel load, tires and boost levels. I don't know if the new damper settings have something to do with it or not, but I thought it was smart leaving them alone. I didn't feel the need for any changes when I was driving, so it was a bit pointless to risk making the car worse again. And that's it. This car isn't the most friendly for a relaxing drive, but you'll get a lot of satisfaction driving it when you start hooking good laps. It's a big challenge, but the reward is quite big too. I hope the driving tips and the setup can help you to enjoy it too. See you next time, and as always, thanks for watching.